A new clip! Bigger weapons!
ファットブラスターズ
Hello everybody, welcome back to Fug Blasters, where we're offering honest, unpaid, unbiased gun reviews. And we did the M14, M1A, you know, whatever, and people got really mad. So here's the Garand. And it's going to be interesting to contextualize the Garand episode because there's two different ways of looking at it. One is at the time, right, when like most of the other semi-automatic rifles were like really
or
fucked
like
up.
the Garand.
Yeah,
They're really fucked up.
Yeah, really fucked up. And I mean, why don't you explain some of the early influences, like what came before the Garand, right?
Right. So the Garand sort of comes in this late 20s, early 30s era where nations have realized the importance of autoloading firearms. I think World War I taught that lesson. It's just that a lot of nations didn't really pick up on that lesson. That maybe automatic rifle isn't quite necessary, but if you can have something that's between an automatic rifle
Right.
and a bolt-action rifle like this, that's actually a huge advantage to you. A lot of nations actually tried, more nations than just America tried to make an autoloading rifle happen in the interwar period.
Right.
Most of those were focusing on some manner of bolt-action conversion. And believe it or not, this is closer to a bolt-action conversion than you may be aware.
But it's important to note like what came before. So we had the RSC, which was gas operated, very traditional, and that was actually in World War I that
Right.
kind of came about. It may have been masked as a refurb program for the Lebel, but it just wasn't. It worked, more filled by the cartridge than anything else. Then there's the direct, the interwar period, and the most direct inspiration on this is the ZH-29.
Right, and so the ZH-29 then borrowed pretty heavily from the RSC as well. So
Right.
sort of RSC had some ideas. Specifically, the sort of gas system was, from the RSC is pretty closely copied here.
Right.
Pretty closely influenced anyway. So you had RSC. The ZH-29 added some ideas as far as how things should be done. The Garand borrowed a little bit from one of the two of these sources. And then it came up with some new ideas on its own.
But the main thing to point out, though, in contextualizing this, right, is that no one had figured out how to do a self-loading rifle. Is that correct?
Right. Nobody had come up with a self-loading rifle that was really good, that had solved sort of the problems that just you can't do that. You can't do that.
What?
You can't do that.
What? Oh,
Have a good gun.
oh. Okay. So, forget that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, get rid of that. But, a lot of the problems, and this is something that Othayers from C and Arsenal has talked quite a bit about, a lot of the problems that was plaguing them, I mean, a big one, right, was manufacturing. That replaceable parts was a thing that was understood. It just, people didn't understand how to do it. And you see that a lot in modern manufacturing these days, where there's a big push. Like, people understand that you can get away from having to mate drill holes in big, complex assemblies. But how you get away from doing that is actually very difficult. And replaceable parts was at the same point then. When it came to the ammunition, powder loadings and burn rates was rather inconsistent, and this was all, powder manufacture was usually done by, like, testing lots, right? You had to quantify and certify everything. And, they had accepted how bad and inconsistent stuff was, that, overpressure ammo was just sort of a thing that happened then, that these days is like, everybody talks about, oh, it totally happened to me, but it probably didn't. It's just right. It's very rare when it happens now, whereas back then it was just a given that, like, you're going to run into overpressure ammo, and it's just, it's a thing that's going to happen. And that's why you see so many rifles around this time built with, they take specific design considerations into account for this rifle will eventually fire an overpressure round. So It's got vents drilled through the receiver because they know this gun's going to try and blow up at some point. These days, you don't see nearly as much of that.
And of course, because we had to deal with a completely locked breech and we had to deal with it being gas operated, that was just, there was no way around that.
Right. What are you doing?
No, it's just something I just found commercially.
Stop.
Just like on the, it was just.
No, you can't do that.
It was in the store. It was
That's
like
not,
1907.
That's not real. No.
Look, I
that's not a
found.
thing.
Look, check it out.
No, you can't do that.
Look, see in the barrel. There's this little.
No, stop.
But why? It was on the store. You could have bought it.
Stop. No, that's not true. Stop.
Okay, you're right.
So
Which I guess that is a point to make, is that gun existed and was way fucking better, but was like wildly expensive and nobody bought it.
So the inventor is a guy by the name of John C. Merrick Garland.
And he's a Canada guy.
Yeah, he's a Canada guy. So
Yeah.
first off, there's differing accounts of how his name is pronounced,
Right.
and I've seen different accounts attributed to him. So he's said his name is said different ways,
Right.
and his descendants have said that the family name was said different ways.
Right.
So what's correct? Who cares? Whatever. I'm gonna go with Gargler.
I'm gonna go with Jugland.
And so he was born in Canada, but very early on, with his parents, I assume, came to the United States, and it's difficult to call him a Canadian because he was brought up in America. And it's not like America was like, oh, we can't design a gun. We need to, because the Canadians tell the story as like, wow, our great gunsmith went to America, made them the great gun. That's not how that happened.
Well, and then the Canadians also say that he had already come up with the design, but he was
like
still
a
here.
7-year-old or something. Yeah.
No, he was thinking about it all that, and then he went over there just to do it.
Right. So there's a little bit of confusion there. He's not really very Canadian.
Right. So let's get that out. Although I think it would be funny for it to be for him to be Canadian, because it would allow us to piss on people who love this gun more.
Right, and so that's sort of segues into, there's a lot of very complex emotions involved in this gun. More like the M14 got a lot of emotions going on with it. Thompson's got a lot of emotions going on with it. Even them combined, I don't think it's close to the emotions that are involved in this gun.
Yeah.
There's a lot of romanticization in films, in video games, in you name it, popular culture at large. For a long time, right, this rifle was the standard of comparison for everything that existed rifle-wise in the entire country. I've read NRA articles from whenever the SKSs and AKs first started coming in. Everything's compared to the Garand. The SKS is compared to the Garand. Everything gets compared to the Garand.
And why wouldn't they, right? Because you can get a Garand for like $3.
Right. There were times when surplus Garands, especially prior to '68, came in that weren't super expensive, but for most of its history, the Garand's been a moderately priced firearm, but it's been omnipresent is probably what it's got going for it. And it does that.
It does that, which everyone loves. And the other interesting thing is that the Garand is unique in the way that it like defined sport shooting.
Yes.
Like a whole like the CMP exists around the Garand. Although like there was a predecessor, like blah blah blah. But the whole idea was we need to put all these guns in the hands of as many people as possible. And they should train with them, and there should be matches and all this shit. And I'm paraphrasing, but it's so that if we ever need to conscript them, we have all of these like super able riflemen. And then like this idea was morphed and tweaked and twisted and kept going, and it gained popularity and like super acceptance, completely coinciding with this rifle, to the point where, despite the fact that we have not issued this in
a long time,
a gorillion years, like it is still the primary match rifle, in a whole series of disciplines, and it like remains the standard of comparison for self-loading iron sight firearms. And like there's such this particular gun is so ingrained in marksmanship culture in the United States that even with the fact that we made like more than 5 million,
it was a ton of
between all of the different manufacturers, it's I don't know how many, it's more than 5 million.
I thought it was like 7 or 8.
Yeah, almost 10 million guns. They're going to be making more.
Yes.
And this is the reason that the CMP has announced that they're going to be making more new production Garands. I think that's retarded.
It's one of the ideas of all time.
And as we take this apart, we'll look at it and explore how I don't think you can actually do that. And it'll either be can is a powerful word, so it'll either be that you'll be able to do it and it'll be disgustingly expensive, or it'll be just wrong. Right? And knowing what I know about who's making the receivers, let's just say I'm terrified. But anyway, all that to say that the like nostalgia factor that we observe in the 1911, that we observe in the M14, is kids play compared to this gun. It is like you are not allowed to talk shit on this gun.
It's American like apple pie's baseball.
Yeah, yeah, it's just like apple pie baseball hamburger, right? You're just not allowed to talk shit on this gun. And so, right now, what are the different ways you can get a Garand, right? So we're skipping ahead. We're going to kind of skip around. So we just covered what was the state of the art at the time that this came out. Now we're talking about this gun in particular and what the state of the market is of these guns right now. And then as we take it apart, we'll go back into a comparison of, hey, this thing's nice to shoot versus what the is that?
Yeah.
Right. So right now, what's the state of the Garand market? You can still go to the CMP and purchase a Lend-Lease return Garand. Those are drying up, and they're drying up so aggressively to the point that the ones you can get right now are like
not fantastic.
kind of fucked up. I remember I got my first Garand from the CMP. It was a 50,000 serial number. I still have it, and it was a Turkish return. And everyone was talking about how beat those things were, but it measured like 2.5 on the bore erosion. It's about the same on the throat. Shoots great. Still love to shoot it. And back then, people were like, "That's roached, right? That's garbage. What are you doing?
Throw
with
that out. You don't want that.
Throw that shit out." And now we got the Philippine returns that like all sat outside and like are substantially rusted. And you're lucky to get a bore that's 3, right, or 4, and and I think it goes up to like. I think 5 is to the point where it's like, okay, well, let's unscrew that.
There was an interesting one with there was a guy who was looking at throat gauging, and he was shooting he had a gun that was like an 8 on the throat gauge, like it was swallowing throat gauges, like he had an extended throat gauge to measure what this gun was, and he was still able to put up original Garand accuracy requirement groups with it, which was like 4 or 5 inches, but that to say that Garands can be kind of roached as far as how the CMP looks at them and still be okay quality guns. Combat
effective.
Right.
Well, combat effective weapons. But that's kind of the interesting thing about the Garand is that, I'm not going to lie, it's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Like, and the reason it's pretty accurate is because this is a bolt action conversion.
Yes.
This is a... and you'll see it as we take it apart, but it's a Mauser 98 that got hit with a steamroller and then whose stepdad was the RSC.
Right.
It's pretty much what it is, and as we take it apart, you'll see that. But so right now you can get the CMP Philippine return guns, and then on top of the metal not being that good, they switched to Hackberry for the more affordable stocks. And it's a hard wood. It's hard wearing. A lot harder than the commercial walnut you'd see on the higher grade guns at the CMP. But it just feels wrong. Like it feels like you're shooting a butcher board.
It doesn't have the satiny feeling to it.
Yeah, it feels like a butcher board, which is what it is. So, that's not great. Then your other options are secondary market, which are primarily people who just take a CMP gun and flip it.
Right.
And so then we were like, well. What about something that is going to be like maximally a good shooter? So right now the gold standard for M1 barrels is Criterion. They really know what they're doing. And so we actually went to Royal Tiger and got a refurb M1. So this would have been an Ethiopian M1 with a Criterion barrel and all of the small parts refinished. To really say, what is this capable of, right? Short of hand lapping and all of this shit that you can do with a Garand.
Right, there's a lot of hyper accurization. Because what with this gun sort of being the accurate rifle standard in the U.S. for some time, there's a lot of things, funny things that happen to these guns where there's lapping here and polishing here, and you bed this but not this, and acro glass here but not there, and then it's only for 3 inches long, and then you want to taper off into a slight cut.
There should be 4.5 pounds of pressure as you're pushing on the...
Right, like all sorts of funny stuff, funny business that they do to sort of accurize these guns. So that's all well understood. But this is more an example of... I mean, frankly, it gets you kind of close to if a new Garand was made today, right? New production barrels, because barrel technology back then was atrocious. So it's a new production Garand barrel on sort of the regular core parts with the stock and the rest of the metal parts that just sort of fit the way they're supposed to.
Right.
Instead of the way that they can be like turbo accurized to.
Right. And so at a reasonable price point, this is going to be how we can kind of gauge, well, what can the Garand do in 2024?
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's great for that, and it is pretty.
Yeah.
You wind up with a mixture of the new barrel, and I do like the way Criterion marks them, because they added their own similar to the way the old barrel contractors would have marked, and in 2023, I just think that's a cute touch, right? Because it just all looks right, and then fascinatingly, the other thing I really like about the Royal Tiger Garands is you just never know what you're gonna get. Like, we have a national match op rod.
Yep.
That wasn't added on. Like, that came like that. Yep. So you just wind up with a lot of interesting stuff. But I mean, the real star of the show is definitely the barrel. Like, that's the heart of the Garand. Everything relates back to that. Well, that and the op rod, which we'll talk about. But I mean, you really can't, in terms of mouthfeel and just a general ergonomic standpoint, there's not much bad to say.
I almost wonder if there is an amount of guns that are in a culture's DNA. Because the 1911 in your hand, right? Objectively, I think the 1911 and the Garand, there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn between them from a standpoint of at the time they were adopted, they were leading the pack in a lot of regards.
Right.
20 years after the fact, they were like miles behind the pack, right? Them shits were straight up obsolete. Stuff was moving fast at this time. But they just feel right. Like, you pick it up, like they look good and they feel right. You pick it up and you feel it, and it's like, this feels normal.
What is that?
5 pounds 9 ounces.
Yeah. So I think 6 to 8 is pretty normal for these.
Yep. So, and that is something that I was thinking about. Is like, does this gun feel good, or am I just an American shooter, right? And this is what I've been like how Puerto Ricans are programmed to think that Hondas are easy to work on.
Right.
Yeah. Whereas I'm like, we're like, bitch, I don't want to take the front of that engine off, or like. But so I don't know, and that's something that would be impossible to quantify, really, or will be until we finish a project we're working on.
Right.
But I don't know. There's something about. I'm trying to complain about this thing ergonomically right now.
It's really. I mean,
well, I've got one.
The op rod shouldn't be exposed like that. It's kind of not great.
Yeah, it is something you don't really notice, though.
If you get, I mean, and for the stature of the people at the time, their hands always would have been right here.
Right.
With big statured people, you can just grab it further out and you'll be fine. But
so here's one thing, and that was actually something the M14 addressed as they covered it. So it had to have been an issue, right?
Right.
But of course, I didn't even think to complain about that. Here's one thing I will complain about. I have always punched myself in the face with Garands with these fingers.
Stock is too short.
Yeah. It's way too short.
Which, again, sort of a stature thing where they made a gigantic long rifle with a too short of a stock because everybody back then was small. Because, I mean, it's an important
It's because we weren't feeding our people. We were doing too much rationing.
It's an important thing to think about still, because in that interwar period, people still weren't completely sold on the idea of carbines being... everybody should actually have a carbine.
Yeah.
What was yesterday's carbine should be today's rifle.
Right.
Not all countries were completely on board with that.
And in fact, I don't know about that.
You even see the Germans, right, with the Mauser 98 carbine. That became their standard infantry rifle.
Yeah.
And it's still a pretty long rifle.
Yeah, the Carabiner 98 Kurs.
And this is a pretty big gun, and it's still probably a little bit longer than it needed to be.
Yeah.
And
we kind of were at the forefront of that with the 1903.
Right.
It's our short rifle.
Right.
Like, that bitch is not a short rifle.
Right.
That's a full-on rifle.
And they're in that post-World War I era, people just didn't really understand to make guns the right size. Right? They're still stuck in that mindset. And so that's the important thing to keep in mind when evaluating the Garand is they really didn't know what the hell they were doing with a lot of this stuff. They hadn't, just like as a conceptual design thing, they hadn't thought their way through things that close. And I guess
really, once we start tearing into this gun, the deeper you tear into it, the more of that you see.
Right. But yeah, let's get into this thing. So,
Disassembly's a little weird.
yeah.
And I know some people like to defend this system, but using the springiness of the steel of the trigger guard to latch it shut is kind of wonky, and you will run into guns that when they shoot just pop that open because the spring has lost its spring.
I actually haven't seen that, but that is funny. The thing I like about this design is that it's meant to be cocked when you take it apart,
Yep.
and the gun actually won't let you do it wrong.
Yes.
So as you're pulling this open, it cocks the hammer.
Yep.
Gotta admit, that's pretty slick. There are different patterns of trigger guard, fire control unit assembly. Some with more milled parts than others. This is a substantially late one. And it's a tractor one. That's cool. International Harvester Company. Nice. The other interesting thing about Garand's is that these aren't serial numbers, and to this day, people continue to like seek a numbers matching gun. And in fact, most of the time, you'll have a gun with different manufacturer parts on it. That's okay. These guns were designed.
They were meant to be replaceable parts as much as is possible.
Right, and the conception was these guns would come into the depot, all be taken apart, all of the parts would be separated and individually serviced, and then all the guns would be put back together, and that would be fine. And in fact, you didn't have the guns. Many of the guns that were made by other, the receivers and parts that were made by other manufacturers, were finished at Springfield.
Yep.
So you would, by default, have a gun that had, a Winchester receiver, this, that, and the other thing. I think all of the Winchesters were finished at Springfield, right? Winchester only made
that. I'm not sure of.
Yeah. It's all. I'm gonna say as much bullshit. I'll just make up shit to make sure the commenters can whatever. But I'll try to predominantly be right. I'll get the small details wrong to boost engagement. But except we'll still probably be more correct than some other ones. The thing that it's always kind of made me scratch my head is back in the days when when I went to Alabama for law school, we would go to the CMP. And people would buy a few guns and then go out into the parking lot and swap parts to try to match them up.
Right.
And I'd be like, you're just being retarded.
Right.
But yeah, that is a thing. The fire control unit actually makes a lot of sense. And those shapes, I think that's got to be Browning inspired.
I think Browning inspired. A lot of people want to point to. The sort of double hook fire control group thing is a Browning design, and a lot of people want to point to every time that's done as being, it was just copied from XYZ Browning gun.
Right.
Very, very certainly, this is not copied exactly from any Browning gun. It is a wholly, as far as I'm aware, a wholly unique fire control group, although the hammer is very ZH-29.
Right.
Especially
with the shape, too.
There's a lot of that ZH-29 going on here. But the fire control group is certainly inspired and based on, if you describe it as a principle, as a philosophy, it's the Browning double hook system.
Right.
But it's more or less...
Which we first saw in the Auto 5, right?
I believe the Auto 5 is the first time it shows up, yeah.
It's good, and it's actually a pretty simple. Well, on principle, it's simple.
Right.
The way Garand put it together is kind of fucked up.
It's a lot of stacked holes.
Yeah, it's very weird. And then the leaf springs too are just to die for. These things are infuriating to take apart too, but they do work, and they're clean and they're crisp, and the way that all of the holes remain relative to each other gives you a very clean trigger experience. Unlike an Enfield, where you're kind of on an Enfield, the trigger is pinning just on the trigger guard, which is independent of the receiver and everything else. On this, the fire control unit is drawn up into the receiver and then pressed down against the stock.
I mean, it locks in tighter than an AR's fire control grip is locked in relative to its bolt parts. So it's got that going for it.
So that's good. And then also, as you'll see here, these contact patches on the back of the stock, this is a huge part of the Garand's accuracy.
is the stock fitment.
Yeah, the stock fitment and how the fire control locks in. And you'll see, like, Garand shooters who, like, they believe that, you know, they leave this unhooked until they're shooting the match.
Right. Don't want to compress the wood or...
Yeah, which is, I don't think that's how that works, but whatever. I think they're actually accelerating the deformation of the stock. So now the ass plug's out. We take off the Brug's chugless. And then the ass block. And with the removal of the ass block, the paw protector comes right off. And then this. Now for the Recoil's spring. This is a regular length recoil spring.
Yeah, only 4.5 feet long.
and then this shape for what actually pins the recoil spring into the receiver.
That's actually insane. And the reason they did it is because they used the recoil spring to drive the feed mechanism.
Yeah. So yeah, that is something to note. It's kind of cool. It's also stupid.
It probably didn't have to be this shape. Again,
Yeah.
this was coming from a point in time where nobody really knew exactly what they were doing when it came to design for stuff like this. I mean, as you can see from a standpoint of, this gas block wasn't the first gas block design, was
Right.
it? The original guns, they were concerned about having gas ports drilled in barrels and how will gas ports. They knew gas port erosion was a thing,
Right.
and so they were worried that, well, if these rifles will be in service for any period of time, the gas ports will erode, or they'll wear out, or it'll cause accuracy issues.
Yeah.
They had all sorts of concerns. So the Garand was originally designed as a gas trap firearm, where there's just sort of a capture can on the end of the muzzle, and it siphons off the muzzle blast to then cycle the gun.
Right.
Which tends to be less reliable. The Germans experimented with the same sort of thing with the Gewehr 41 Walther, the Walther one.
Yep.
But
The one that didn't listen to the contract.
right. So it is one of the systems of all time, and just sort of indicative of the fact that they really didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
Messing around with a lot of this stuff. There was a lot of trial and terror is probably the best way to describe it. Where
Yeah.
ideas were tried, and then some stuff worked and some didn't. And in the case of the Garand, the development on it stopped probably before it should have.
Right.
It got to the point that the gun worked, and then it was selected.
Well, so then all that to say here, this shape of the recoil spring, it could have just ended, normal, but instead we have these absurd shapes, and it's because then we get a linear motion here, which translates into the entire magazine.
Yep.
And that's, I mean, you might say, oh, that's cool, right? Because you only need one spring. Well, I'd rather have more springs than...
What does springs cost to make? What do 20 different finely machined steel parts cost to make?
Yeah, and these are all, like, really dumbass shapes.
Yep.
And then you have this floating piece here, which we'll take out in a second, which only exists so that you can put the end block in either way. And it's ludicrous, really. All of this is driven off the recoil spring. So yeah. Anyway, that said, recoil spring. Then we've got the op rod. Op rod and the whole bolt system, which is probably the biggest nightmare on this gun. So, as you can see, you wind up with a completely normal snake shape,
Yes.
which is something that's very easy to machine.
Yes.
And
It's fastened in two pieces to this, I believe, cast machined part.
yeah,
And it's there's a lot of shapes going on here. None of this is like a normal shape. Machining it would be a
Right.
multi operation setup operation.
and also like explaining to another country how to do this
Yes.
would also be very difficult. And so the op rod winds up being one of the several Achilles tendons on the Garand, and it's to the point where when you're putting them together, there's specific ways to test them, And why don't you show us how you make sure your op rod's good?
There's a pretty like he was saying. There's a severe immaturity in the op rod system, and so the way that it's been a while since I've done this, but the way I've seen that you're supposed to test the op rod is that on a op rod, such as this, there's really only three spots that it's supposed to be touching the receiver, or the barreled assembly. Up front at the piston inside the gas block. Right here on this lug that rides in a rail inside of the receiver, and then the cam track interfaces with the bolt. It's allowed to have partial contact with the barrel right there, but that's supposed to just be sliding contact. If this ends up being wearing a groove in it, something more than just finish wear, that's indicative of an op rod having a problem. So the test that I've seen that's sort of like the quick and dirty test is with the rifle assembled as so, with no spring in it or anything, with the charging handle facing up, supposed to be able to tilt it, and by the time it reaches a 45, it should slide. This one feels about there. This gun also doesn't have much grease on it, but certainly before the time it gets vertical, it should move on its own. And this one's doing that. Whenever you have a bent op rod, it will cause the op rod to rub in weird places. And this is sort of an op rod that we have as an example of that. So here you see it's got wear all underneath on this surface. This surface shouldn't really be touching the receiver except very incidentally. And of course that op rod's recently refinished, but here's one of a similar vintage to this one that has almost all the finish here as opposed to almost none of the finish here. And that's usually just a sign that the op rod has taken a slight bend to it. We could do the tilt test with this one. Op rods can have a little bit of bend and just be fine and work.
Yeah. Like this one is very clearly bent to the left.
So this one still works like it's supposed to, although this op rod does have a slight bend to it. I can't see it from
Garand's are regular. Yeah, look, you just got to do it normal.
There you go. So this op rod, usually I've seen them bend more here than on the tube itself, although because you look along the top of this machined part, it makes it look like the tube is bent, even though it's something here that is. Although I've seen people online talk about tubes getting dented or bent, because this tube is a very thin wall, which
it's also pretty hard. But so yeah, what he's saying there is, as you look down this piece, you'll think, oh, the tube itself is bent, when in reality it's more likely that the bend happened here. And most of these guns were like redone to add this cut, this radius here, whereas previously it was a hard edge. Yeah.
And so they didn't have a lot to go with, and so they came up with something that, frankly, they put a hollow tube connected to a bolt action conversion shape.
Right, and that's exactly what this is. It's a remote bolt action turner. So here, real quick, let's get the rest of these op rods because I want to make a point here.
Right.
Let's just take. We've got here 4 Italian op rods. And I would just like to do the test on all of them and just see what happens. That's 45. So it goes open happy. Yeah, you're not supposed to have to shake it. Right. So this one's a technical fail, right? Yep.
It's not supposed to have such wear marks there.
So we'll put that there. Technical fail. Wear marks. You have to shake that one going out. But it's happy going forward. See, let's try it again. There's 45.
Keep going. About 60.
Yeah.
So it's got a little bit more drag is what that's indicative of.
Okay, this one's good.
Well, not perfect going back like that previous one. It wasn't perfect going back.
And one more going forward.
Goes forward easy.
2 that kind of failed. 2 that kind of passed. And then the only one we have that was clearly passed was our refinished one here. Which, mind you, this is the only like super active military surplus weapon I know of where there is a dude whose whole job, his whole life, is he just repairs op rods.
Yeah.
Well, before we go into the receiver as an independent component, I guess we can finish taking this apart. The way the bolt comes out,
It's not intuitive. It's just sort of like it wiggles out of there.
it kind of comes out at one point. You look at that, you look at the front of it, and you sit there, with the exception of the spring-loaded ejector. Aside from the plunger ejector,
I mean,
it looks like a Mauser 98.
hide the operating lug.
Yeah.
It's you're starting to look an awful lot like a Mauser style bolt.
Yep. With a shortened version of the same type of extractor, like the overall shape of it, the way it kind of curves around it.
Only this being push feed instead of control feed.
Yeah. When you look at the overall profile of it, it is just a tubular or cylindrical, I guess, turn bolt. Like this.
That sort of has this area flattened so that it can add itself a rail in the front and back so that it rides in the receiver. The bolt doesn't have a carrier. The bolt rides in the receiver directly, which is contrary to most other autoloading rifles.
I will say I love the idea of this feature, the rear of the firing pin, if only it worked.
Yes.
So the idea here is that the hammer won't be able to present to the firing pin unless it's fully in battery.
And then there's a corresponding notch in the receiver.
Right. There's a corresponding notch in the receiver that it would allegedly prevent that tail from going through. The minor detail is it never worked out that way, and you can always get through.
There's plenty of pictures of Garands that have fired out of battery that would lead you to believe this out of battery system doesn't work as well as maybe it could or should.
Get that bitch in there. So, obvious there, that's how it's meant to work, right? The issue is when it's out of battery, there's that ramp there, and there's a lot of clearance here.
Yeah.
So, like, this could be locked out of battery, whereas the firing pin tail could kind of cam over, peek over, and at that point, look at how much we're sticking out. Like, we're pretty fucking unlocked.
And with with ARs, with things that have straight cut lugs, right, as opposed to helically cut locking lugs, it's not as massive an issue if you're like 3 or 4 degrees out of battery.
Right.
But with helical cut lugs, 3 or 4 degrees out of battery means your lugs aren't touching at all. Nominally, right? That means that you've just increased headspace.
Right.
Whereas with an AR, once the bolt's all the way forward, headspace is closed up, and all it does is just lock into position.
Right. So there's your magazine. That's fucked.
Yes.
That's not right. So here it is, like, oriented the same way as the gun.
And so you've got recoil spring pressure trying to push this up the whole time.
Yep.
And this is sort of your follower, if you will. And the peak on the follower is biased. You're able to bias to either side because, depending on which way you put the first round in the clip, it may be on the left or the right. So if it fits on it like that, or if you flip a clip over, it's still on the same side,
right?
Because it's an even number of rounds.
Loaded it, right?
So if you had this round over here instead, it would you would toggle this over to the other side, and that's an awful lot of complexity for what it is. And sort of the interesting thing is, if you had a 9-round clip, you could have got around that by just telling soldiers always have it on the right side and avoided having that toggle.
Right.
But then from a standpoint of, are they actually going to be aware of that? And then if you're getting shot at and you're trying to put this in there quick, it probably
many
helps.
stripper clips were unidirectional.
Yeah.
And it was probably, I could see that not working out. So, it makes sense.
It's just an example of how much complexity can be forced into a gun because of the fact that you're like, okay, the end user's a mixture of not that bright and also not going to, even if they are bright, they're not going to remember the things they need to remember whenever they're worried about not dying instead.
Right. And this nominally comes apart.
Yes.
But I feel like it's traumatic because you wind up having to, bend some substantially thick steel, and again, this is just this is a super complicated little piece. all of these little angles do something.
Yep.
And then there's a dovetail, and then a key seat, and the key seat is what's actually pushing, like responsible for your upward movement.
Yep.
And then all of these little shapes, well, they're simple, right? They correspond with all of these little shapes.
Yes, tons of key seat cuts inside of the receiver.
Inside the receiver. And then we have additional shapes to clear the rib, right? So we've got 2 sets of ribs on the clip itself to ensure that it goes in linearly, right? Not insane. You do want to, right? You do want your clip to go in, right? And so then you have additional geometry to trip this once your feed lip has gone beyond a certain point. I can kind of show you guys how that works. So there's an empty clip, right? There's your mag follower. I don't think anyone has really shown how this works.
Maybe in cutaways, at least.
Yeah.
With the actual parts.
Again, we've got all of the stupid-ass parts of our magazine. But how does it do the funny? Well, your mag follower, right, is connected via this stupid arm, which has its own little timing pieces, through the same axis pin as this little guy. This arm, when the time has come, right, because everything's related together, will trip this release.
Which you can actuate outside the gun like
Yeah.
this.
Yep. It will trip that release and effectively clear this lock on the clip. But what is going to power that thing out of there? And I guess just we can show you. There's just this stupid ass little spring on the bottom of the fire control. We've got our fire control in there. We've got the little stupid spring. This is how it would normally be. And once you've fired your last round, this is going to pull down on that release, which is the same as the clip release. And despite the fact that the bolt is closed, it won't do anything because the bolt will be physically retaining the clip. But when the bolt opens, that's how that happens. It's a lot less magic when you see it, you know, when you see the mechanical goings on, because it really is as stupid as just the exposed leg of a spring in the fire control and a lock. But I guess what makes it interesting and complicated is that it's all dependent on the like weird ass recoil spring driven timing here.
Yep.
Because it just has to, like, this only knows how high to be because it's connected indirectly by way of the recoil spring with this little shitter. I mean, I guess it's, I don't want to say elegant, but it's something.
From a design perspective, pulling off what this design accomplishes, as far as kicking the clip out of there whenever the gun is empty, is a pretty complicated thing.
Right.
And the way this gun pulled it off, I mean, the more you read about Garand's, right, they were plagued by it wanting to kick the clip out or jamming on the 7th round consistently.
Right.
And they thought maybe it was which side you put the first round in on, and they chased their tails on that for a long time, the infamous 7th round stop or whatever.
That's just because shit got bent.
Right. And so they faced a lot of issues with these guns, but in terms of pulling off what they pulled off here, it's a really good execution.
Yeah.
The question about whether or not that's a good idea in an era when they knew about box magazines, right? The BAR showed them that even 30-06 box mags work good.
Well, hold on, you're going too far. Remember they did all this shit with, like, this extra, like, this whole stupid part just to make sure the clip came up.
Yep.
They didn't need to do that. They could have just had a hole in the bottom like every other end block did, and it would have worked just as well to shove in a fresh one when it locked open. Probably would have been more reliable too.
Almost certainly.
Yeah, and
because I mean, there's nothing under here.
No, and as we saw when the Italians moved to the BM-59, you know what the first thing they did was just cut this out.
And put a magazine in it.
Yeah, they just cut it out and put a mag in it. Of course, we never could have had the thought of having a magazine in a self-loading rifle.
And again, a lot of that, I think, was more doctrinal than anything, right? Because they didn't want an automatic rifle.
Right.
And I'm sure in their minds they saw giving a guy 20 rounds, well, now he's just an automatic rifleman, right?
Right.
And that, the Garand could have been the M14 in the 30s. Could have happened. But it didn't. Doctrinal reasons are probably mostly...
Well, because remember, we had the box mag, we had the 30-06 box mag for the BAR over a decade ahead of this. It wasn't a lack of technology, it was a lack of desire. But if they had done the clear through option, it would have probably saved a lot of GI's lives, because as you know, that sound
sound of the clip being ejected got a lot of guys, a lot of good boys,
a lot
killed.
of the boys that got krilled from and that's one reason I like the Garand, is because there's so much bullshit that's just made up.
Like once you have a gun that's such a flashpoint of American gun owning cultural identity, just the most insane things get said about it. And the M1 carbine's got its own fair share of this, where it can't penetrate a winter coat. Or
the winter coat, yeah. They're super cool in a lot of respects. We'll talk about the receiver in 1 second. I think that's the last thing we've really got to talk about. But I do want to heap praise on one thing, and that's the rear sight.
Yes.
That's a good rear sight. Like, it... very clearly adjustable elevation, and then very click bar adjustable windage with reference points and everything. It's not to the point of like the 1903 Springfield where it's a target sight and it's just fucked up and there's no possible way to use it.
Right.
This is as good as the M16A2 sight, which I think you like the A2 sight better, right? I love the A2 sight. This is just like the A2 sight. Way back further, though. I think it's great.
It's a ruggedized target sight. Is probably the best way to say it. Where it's a target peep sight. It's a little bit ruggedized. And it's got a little bit bigger aperture than you'd see on maybe the most target of target sights.
And I got big crankers. Yeah.
That way you can go out all the way.
You shoot them all the way. So let's look at kind of the last major failure point here, and that's the receiver. And the receivers are a failure point because they do this.
Yeah, they do eventually crack at the rear. You can find lots of pictures online. And
no, this one didn't crack in a normal way. This cracked in something funny happened to this gun.
Something fell on it or something.
Yeah. But when you kind of look at this receiver by itself, it becomes very clear why it's so difficult to accurize or to put a scope on these guns. There are no parallel lines. There are, but they're
not
an eighth of an inch wide. Yeah. Where are you going to put an optic? Where you're not going to. On top of that, that's a totally normal bolt path.
Yes.
That's a totally regular in human design.
Right. The common saying is that back then labor was cheap and machines were expensive.
Right.
It leaves you to wonder how cheap must labor have been that this putting a part through this many operations was more efficient than just having a little bit better machine do something.
There's a lot of dumbass shapes in this, but hey, I mean, it's not a fundamentally weak action. It is not a fundamentally strong receiver.
I think it's a fundamentally immature action.
Yeah, it's
because,
very
the follow-ons to this, right? The M1 action at large. I think the more you scale it down, the better or less bad I'd say it ends up being. Where into the Mini 14, the Mini 30, the Deerfield carbine, things like that, even the M1 carbine itself, right? Whenever you scale it down that far, I think it becomes a little bit better, a little bit more robust, right? Ruger got away with casting for the 14 and 30 receivers, and I think I've seen a few pictures of ones that have cracked, but not nearly as many as I've seen.
But yeah, no, Garand receivers love cracking. And also, when you just look at it, the safety factor just really isn't there. And this is one of the main reasons I'm concerned about the new production Garands, because these were forged in machines, right? Yeah, this is forged and then machined, and I don't know who has the forgings.
Probably nobody at this point.
Yeah, maybe Italy got them, but now they're gone, right? Because they're the only ones I know of that like really, really, really sat down to make Garands aside from us. You know, they probably, but the original stuff probably became M14 stuff and then got thrown in the garbage.
That'd be an M14 person question, and I will never be.
Yeah, but anyway, this is not something that you can easily just machine out of billet. And it's not something that you can easily just cast.
No, I mean, you just straight up can't get away with casting it.
And multiple people have tried.
Right, you have end of the receivers break off, which is incredible.
Yeah.
You have lugs shear off. You have receivers crack at the front. I've seen
especially this lug. This lug is concerning. Right?
I've seen barrel hoods crack.
Right. So this is. You really need to have a forging to get that grain structure to where this is safe with full pop cartridges, and I feel like the modern inclination is to just do it out of billet, and I don't.
I mean, with billet that's heat treated properly, and has you pay attention to the grain direction of the billet, you could probably get most of the way there and be okay.
You're right, but that's a far shot away from it's safe because of modern manufacturing technologies.
Whenever you stop and compare this to stuff like sort of the gold standard for automated machining has ended up coalescing around the AR,
right? And
that's sort of a chicken and egg situation to some extent, but regardless, that's the way it is. Whenever you compare like an AR upper or lower, right, also forgings, to this, also a forging that then gets machined, that the machining process for this is horrendous. The machining process for an AR lower or an AR upper is way simpler.
Yeah.
It's almost incomprehensibly simpler.
Yeah, where there's two slots we have to make sure they're the right size.
Right.
This is you have to do the receiver now, now that you have your blank. But yeah, so that's all the receiver talk. That's the general manufacturing. So like whereas let's go backwards here. This cast it, no problem. It's fine.
Yep. Who cares?
It's a fucked up stamping. Oh shit! Look at this. This came off of our gun here, Beretta. This part sucks. You could cast that. If I was making this today, that's cast.
Yeah.
This mag, it really isn't that much easier.
That's just a really, really weird part.
Yeah, this part just sucks. I don't know if you save much money casting this versus just machining it from billet.
Right, there's a straightforward casting. That's a bar feed thing.
Yeah. This is the happiest part on the whole fucking gun.
It's the only part that's normal.
Yeah. And this.
Yes.
Then the trigger group, that's all fucking you cast that whole fucking thing.
Yeah.
Yep. It was like... And it would be okay. It would.
Right. A lot of people get bad taste in their mouths about casting because casting's often done in place of something that's more expensive, like something that should be billet, they cast to make it cheaper.
Right. Whereas this should be billet.
Right. Or something that should be forged is cast because forgings are more expensive. Then that gives people a bad feeling about cast, but cast is fine to do in a lot of cases. Like look at high power frames, right? They tried doing forged high power frames and they cracked. And part of that's because they forged them in they've got the grain direction going in the wrong direction, but the forged high power frames are substantially weaker than the cast high power frames. So casting doesn't necessarily equal bad every time. It's just that a lot of the times, and sometimes even in the more especially in the case of pressure bearing components, cast doesn't always equal okay. That said, Ruger has made a lot of money. They made a company out of casting pressure bearing parts. So Ruger gets to break the rules, but
it's interesting. So like a lot of the Garand is like a lot of the shit that would have just been garbage to make back then is totally fine to make now. In fact, you could even mim some of these parts. But
probably could.
Yeah, and it may be easier or not.
And it would be about probably equivalent quality of the castings they were getting back then, to be honest.
And so, you know what I'm going to want to see? I'm going to want to get my hands on one of those new production Garands, and we're going to take that bitch apart and see how they did everything.
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not convinced that those guns are going to, I'm not convinced they're going to work. I'm not convinced that's ever going to get off the ground. I think it'll work, but I don't think they're going to be able to produce it to a point where it's going to make any sense to buy, especially where they made 5 gorillion of these things. A lot of this shit can be made right now. Your big problems, though, are right here and right here. This can be done on a bar feeder. Yeah. It would be with a lot of machine time, but that's not your big deal, and that's a really important part. The problem is these two are the heart of your action. This is all of the safety right here. And if you can make one and the other's like, right, then that means the whole gun is right. A question mark. Just because it's like there, yeah.
It's more straight in than the Mini 30s where they need a little bit more rock.
I broke it. Just kidding.
Jump, crane.
I do love the way the trigger feels, and I've now started to I'm wondering if I've gaslit myself to the point that that's cool. As it's going forward, you can see the little tongue unhooking the thing. Yeah, that makes it all worth it.
So that's the M1 Garand in a nutshell.
Yeah,
we've got a pretty interesting gun, all things considered. Oh yeah, and then I guess Garand thumb.
It's not real. Have a good day. But anyway, so let's take this thing. Let's shoot it. And see what it does. I've gotten a new kill. Put a new gnaw in my stock.
A new clip. I need bigger weapons. See what happens. I'm on top left. Let me know when you hit record.
Yep. It's about 3 inches high, 1.5 inches left.
Well, I'm just going to keep the same hold and see what we get.
Yep.
Cool. It feels really smooth. Of course, you'll see this is why they got a national match front sight, because that front post completely obscures the bullseye at 100.
Right.
But hey, how was that?
The last, I guess the second to last two pulled to the right quite a bit.
Yeah, that was
one of them's like 6 inches right, but
was probably me covering the whole thing with the front post, but
Right.
I mean, what do you think for 100? Pretty decent.
It's not bad, yeah, for iron sights.
That was a bullseye.
Hold that one right.
It didn't go that far right. Oh, that was a really cool keyhole. Or it might, no, that wasn't a keyhole. It blew up the backstop. There you go. Hey, interesting. That was a lot looser than the first group. I'm starting to really think that this is an ammo situation. Let's...
Oh yeah, interesting.
So we've got two different types of ammos left. We've got Turkish surplus, which is the newest stuff we've got. And then we got this high quality Russian semi-belted Huntsman ammo. That's definitely the tightest. That one came out.
Yeah.
I heard it.
Those last two are off the target.
Like low?
I assume so, but I'm not sure.
Because I'm holding pretty low. Alright, hold on.
That was good. That was on the low edge.
That didn't feel good.
Yeah, it's not bad though.
Really?
Yeah.
It's probably because they're in such a fucking hurry.
Oh yeah, that kicks way more. That's a cool one.
Yeah, it's different.
It's a 7th round stop, but not really. 7th round won't feed.
I hate to admit it, but that's the tightest shooting ammo.
Oh, it's super consistent for the both of us.
Yeah. There you have it, folks. If you want to do good, you got to shoot the good stuff. That's Barnaul Ammunition Russia.
You could still get that stuff, right?